It's my pleasure and honor today to introduce Dr. Eugenia Krimmel to the podcast. She has a book out called Accelerating Newcomer Literacy, an integrated writing process playbook for English learners. We know that in the field, we are so interested about newcomers. So when I saw that you had a book published, Dr. Krimmel on LinkedIn, I said, let's have you on the podcast. And you were so gracious enough to come on the podcast. So, Dr. Krimmel, welcome.
Great. Thank you very much, Ton. It was nice to talk with you, and I appreciate you having me here. I've followed your work ever since I discovered you on the empoweringels.com website a few years ago, if you remember that. And of course, you have it a website still, but with a slightly different name. But I must say, your resources have supported countless teachers, including me. So I just want to thank you for your excellent work and the value that you add to our profession. So thank you so
Oh my,
much for
oh,
having
that's
me
a,
here.
oh my goodness. Thank you for, I'm so happy that somebody is reading the website besides my boyfriend. So he pretends
No,
to read it.
no, I love the bathroom briefs. Yeah,
Oh
I use
yes,
those
no,
a lot
that
with
thing.
my counseling and my consulting and all of that. Yeah.
Well, it's an
So very
honor.
clever,
It's an
very
honor.
clever.
Yeah, thank you.
But thank you also for allowing me to come and talk about my book and how we can help newcomers to accelerate their language acquisition.
Well, let's talk about the book then. What was the seed for this book? Every book has a seed. What was this one?
Right. Yes. Well, this kind of grows from two situations or two seeds. The first is my own lived experience as a newcomer. So when I was a teenager, I signed up to be an exchange student and ended up in a village in Turkey. So I was a newcomer to Turkey and to Turkish, and I ended up in a small village where no one spoke any English, and I spoke no Turkish. So luckily, my family handed me a dictionary, and I used that to communicate what I wanted to, but I found that I wasn't pronouncing the words correctly because the alphabet, even though it's Latin, still had some differences. So I began writing a lot more before I started speaking. And I found that inversion, if you will, with writing as a sort of a doorway to speaking and reading, sort of stuck with me my entire 3 decade career now in ESL, English as a second language, or some call it English as an additional language, educational career. So, and then the second seed, if you will, is my various roles in this career of mine, as an ESL teacher, consultant. I was the state bilingual advisor at the Pennsylvania Department of Education for a few years, an adjunct professor, and now I'm an ESL instructional coach in a cyber school, which is some people call it a virtual school, but it's a cyber school. Yeah, the students learn all day, every day, in through the digital platform. So very challenging, but I repeatedly saw on how underprepared teachers were to teach writing, especially to newcomers and level one students in particular. So even graduate programs, you know, um, don't really have explicit training for teaching writing. I don't know if you've noticed that or not, but and so it's just almost non-existent to have that. So when I was asked to lead Millersville University's ESL Practicum Institute. Yeah, and knowing Pennsylvania because you had gone to school there, you know where Millersville University is, and here near Lancaster, Pennsylvania. But the graduate students that I taught summer after summer worked with a group of level one migrant education students. And so we had partnered with the Migrant Ed program because they do a summer institute for 5 weeks themselves to help these students learn English before they go back into the next school year. So it was very interesting to watch because the um, Migrant Ed students were identified level one, but not one of them spoke Spanish. And the graduate students expected, to have some knowledge of Spanish or brought their Spanish translations with them. But the students were from African and Asian countries. So my graduate students had to learn, the nature of Kinyarwandan and Somali and Dari and Pashto. And, it was a real learning experience all around. It was great. So, but I couldn't find a practical guide to use with my graduate students to help them learn how to do the writing at this very basic level. So I wrote one. So I used my strategies that I had been using for many, many years, and things I remembered from, my own exchange student experience. And so over the summers, we tested these strategies over and over again. And each graduate student chose 2 case study students within their class that they were assigned to. And the program was kindergarten through high school. So 2 or 3 graduate students were in the classes with the students. And in just 4 weeks, so like 16 instructional hours, because we did Monday through Thursday, these case study students, 100% of them increased in one aspect of literacy in that short amount of time. And so that's why I thought to myself, wow, if we could have an impact like this in just 4 weeks, imagine what impact we could have over a school year. And that's how the book was born.
So everything happens for a reason, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So tell us about what your graduate students do. What did you instruct your graduate students to do in those 2 weeks to help the migrant workers acquire migrant workers grow their English to one level next?
Right. And it wasn't necessarily one level next, but they increased in 4 weeks. So the students had writing cycles each week. So for 4 weeks in a row, from Monday through Thursday, they went through the L writing process, which is what I'm introducing in the book. And it's aligned with the writing process. So, the pre-writing stage, writing, editing and revising, I put those together, and then the publishing stage. And so I taught them these 8 techniques. And the first week that we met in school, and then in our graduate class, and then they launched into it, and we're working with the students for the next 4 weeks. And, so they had to use the techniques, and they learned, a lot about how to work with level 1 students. So they would have classes of maybe 12 students at a time. And then there was a migrant education main teacher, because we only had the ELA time. They also learned science and math during this, program, the summer program. And then in the afternoon, they had games and fun and all of that. So we really literally only had 16 hours in a summer, in a month, to teach them these literacy skills, and they improved in one way or another. So it was pretty impactful, and I was pleased. So yeah.
So this program is specifically about newcomers, and this book is specifically about newcomers.
Right.
Tell us about the basics of language acquisition, particular for newcomers. What do they need?
Sure. Exactly. I work a lot, or have been working a lot, with content teachers as either consultant or a coach or what have you. And I know that they look at language acquisition, or they look at learning and their scenario as more of a cognitive activity rather than linguistic learning. So I usually present to them 3 main stages, and that is exposure. So introduction of, the words and the situations, and then contextual meaning. So that we talk about how they can facilitate contextual meaning, and then repetition. So I give them those 3 sort of tenets, if you will, and then we talk through, because each one of those is very complex. But we talk about the ways that they can provide the exposure and introduction so that a level one student can take it in to the best of their ability, the scenario and all. And then the contextual meaning, making sure that they know. For example, I was observing one of my high school graduate students presenting a unit on drama, and she used an expression, marching off stage. And she was just reading this list to these newcomers who were just looking at her, so politely smiling, no idea what she was saying, of course. And, so I was observing this a little bit. So afterwards I said to her, how do you think that went? And she said, oh, I have no idea. And I said, well, that word March, I said, that can be confusing because it's also a month. And I said, a March is, an action verb that you could demonstrate. So I said, tomorrow, not only do you need a visual word wall, which we'll talk about again in a few minutes here, but I'd love to see you do some gestures so that you give him the context or him. There was one particular student who was definitely confused. He was an Anuak speaker. I even had to look up that language. So he was from a part of Ethiopia, and we had no idea, what the nature of his language. We had to learn about that. But, he was definitely confused. And so I said, next time show that, so that's what she did. So she gave that contextual meaning by actually marching and, helping the student to understand, and then building in that need for repetition. We have to do things over and over again because, you learn something once, you forget it. So we have to learn again. So when I talk to content teachers about language acquisition, I say it's not just, showing it to them and saying, okay, now they've got it. They have to see it again and again, for a long, I said to them, think about when you first learned to drive, or more recently when I'm now learning the Excel spreadsheet, because our school went from Google to Microsoft, and we've all had to, make this switch. And it's like, Excel could drive one insane. But, you learn over time by repetition, doing the same things over and over again. So they get that, they get that through the analogy. But, so often, Ton, I had seen the newcomers sort of relegated to the side and asked to color in the lovely, picture of the frog instead of the rest of the, class. The rest of their peers are engaged in the lesson. I mean, as a consultant, I saw this. And while I was doing my dissertation, I did some observations, and, I was seeing teachers having the newcomers at their desk just copying the words from the board as if somehow that was going to magically make that comprehensible. It kind of broke my heart. And when I'd ask the teachers, they'd say, well, they have to learn to speak before they can write. And I said, oh, where'd you learn that? I said, I know there's, wisdom with that when you're learning your first language, because, that's the way human beings learn. They don't come out with a pencil in their hand and, being able to write. So, they're equating that. And yet newcomers are not toddlers. They come with a linguistic system. And, some of them have strong educational backgrounds, and they can attempt to write and to read, as I did when I was 17 and, working with Turkish. Now, not all newcomers are beginners, as we know. So when I use the word newcomer in the book, I do want to stress that I'm talking about those at the level one, emerging, beginning, whatever scale you're using, because, some of them come with a variety of English levels that they already have. They've had opportunities to engage with English instruction in one way or another. So, but then we also have newcomers who are illiterate or low literate in their language. And those students, I think, are in particular need of this kind of personalized instruction that you'll see in the L writing process. I think it really lends itself to giving them the exposure and the individualized meaning of words, and then also helping them through repetition, which we'll see shortly. So,
which is actually a perfect time to talk about the 8 techniques for the L writing process. Would you
sure.
start? Would you share with us?
Yes, yes. In fact, I have a visual for those who are um, on video. May I share my screen? Okay.
Yes, please.
There we go. So this is sort of a simple view, if you will, of the L writing process. And on the left side, you see the four sort of buckets, if you will, or phases of the writing process that most of us have learned either as students and then, later use it as teachers. The first being the pre-writing step, and then the writing step, and then the edit and revise step. As I said, I put those together, and then the publish step. So for the pre-writing step, the two L focused techniques that I have incorporated in that is level one, materials and tasks. And we'll get into that a little bit in a moment, but basically trying to simplify things for the students. And then model a final product. We've found over the years that that is really important for all students, but it also gives the newcomers an idea of what is expected of them. And the model also helps the teacher to be able to show two things. One, the draw to draft technique, and the word line tool. So teachers can demonstrate that by doing the final model product there. So, but the draw to draft is, giving ELs an opportunity to sort of have a bridge between their thoughts and producing that in English. And then the word line tool is it's a kind of placeholder, and that helps with the flow of writing for the English learners and particularly newcomers. And then the edit and revise stage techniques are really geared towards the newcomers. And this is teacher underwriting and phonics flexing. And they take a little bit of explanation, but these two things are the ones that are most geared towards the level one students. They really don't need it much more after, once they reach level two, they have other means of being able to learn the language and progress in the acquisition of the language. But initially, these two things will help them. And they're very personalized. It's a one-on-one sort of conference, teacher-student. And you can see exactly what the students are struggling with and what they're acquiring, which is very encouraging for sure. And then the published stage is the Write to Spell mini lessons, and those are going to be created by the teacher based on the errors that they see in the writing side of things, and then rewrite for repetition, and then publishing. So those are the basic techniques that go through the L writing process.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing that visual for the teachers to have that. But now we'll go through each of the phases. So let's start with the first, the pre-writing. What does that look like?
Sure. So pre-writing is sometimes inaccessible to newcomers, because teachers are either talking too much or they give them too much information. They often give them a textbook graphic organizer that's just too much language, in that, and they get a little bit glazed over, or it's just too much, to take in. So this is, I tell the teachers that this is the stage to show, and don't just tell them what they have to do. You really have to work with the visual word walls, as I mentioned before, if at all possible. It doesn't have to be color necessarily, but a lot of my students did, get colored pictures to put next to the word wall words. But they can also do drawings themselves, the teachers. Some of the graduate students did that. But really, try to enhance the situation. And usually I would start my graduate class by doing lessons in Turkish and having them feel, I would do I call them sensitivity training, so that they knew kind of what they needed to make sense of what I was saying. And then we were able to apply that. Some of them anyway, some of them needed, of course, some guidance along the way. And then the gestures, again, I told them, ESL teacher. I mean, you see me now. I'm talking with my hands. Typically that's what we do. And they need that. They need the kind of movement in learning. I believe it's just more powerful and it's multisensory as well. So those are the kind of things that you need to do in the pre-writing, making sure that you have representation of the content in the most simplistic way possible. You can simplify graphic organizers as well, take out some of the fluff that I say, and just have hint words in there to help them know where they're supposed to put what on a graphic organizer, and then provide the models of the final product, what you want them to do, the expectation you have for the students to do that. I mean, keep in mind, a newcomer will probably not write a whole lot, compared to, other students. But it will take them as long, to write that. And that's great. We're going to celebrate all of that. And then we're going to use that for instructional material a little bit later on in the writing process. So you want to set that up and make sure that the newcomers feel ready to be able to write. So that's the pre-writing stage.
Let's contextualize it for teachers. Let's pretend that we're going to do a hypothetical unit or a hypothetical lesson. Can we apply this pre-writing to a specific example? It might be like the phases of the butterfly cycle, or it might be like causes of the Industrial Revolution or whatever. Can you just pick a context?
Sure. Yes. So depending on what the writing was of the writing workshop that the students were doing. For example, one group of students was doing they were doing explanation, and the students had to explain a game or a sport. And so they would go through and talk about favorite sports, and they would have different pictures and ask the students to pick a favorite sport. So they would either point to one or what have you. As level one students. If you're in a mixed group of level ones and other students, you can do this in a variety of ways. But our students, the graduate students at that time knew that the whole class was level one. So they had pictures, and then, choose your favorite sport. And then if there was a sport that they wanted to talk about or a game they wanted to talk about, they could, add that in there. And try to explain it, as best they could. So the teacher would facilitate that. Another context would be writing about a narrative, and so they wrote about a celebration and what happened in the celebration, and so the teachers would model a celebration that they love, like maybe Christmas or Hanukkah or something. And then they have a graphic organizer, just 4 boxes. One was people. So who was at this celebration? One was food, and then, so what kind of what you eat in the celebration. Activities was another one, was the third box. So were there games, did you get together as a family, that kind of thing. And then lastly, why do you like this? And so the teachers would demonstrate this through drawing, which we'll talk about in a moment. And but through the pre-writing process, they were modeling the process that they were going through, the thinking process. And then they were also modeling the words that could be. So they were asking the students, different celebrations, and getting words for all the different boxes, and putting those all up, on the board or on a word wall. And then the teacher would provide a final product, so 3 to 5 sentences, for example, and show the students what's expected of them. So that was the pre-writing. And that would happen on a Monday in our institute, actually. So all of that would be Monday, in 1 hour. And, but it was great. It really, you could see the newcomers were engaged, they were contributing. They were also helping each other out. Which was great, because cell phones were put away. So there were cell phones on the front in a box, and they weren't allowed to use the translators. So, they were relying on their own knowledge and the collective knowledge, which also represents the culture that they come from, collectively helping each other. So
So let's move to the writing instruction phase. Let's use those two contexts, maybe the one about sports and the one about celebrations. And what does writing look like now at this
great. So
phase?
writing, as I mentioned earlier, it really needs a bridge from the thought process to the actual, writing or producing English, because they have lots of ideas, but like I did when I was 17. I mean, I had lots of things I wanted to say, but then I had to think about, well, how do I communicate this? What words do I use? What order of the words? Because in Turkish, for example, the verb is at the end. I didn't know that at first, so I was always writing sentences in my context and my grammar, and then I was corrected. So so I learned a lot about the order of things, and these students are very similar. So I found, though, that the bridge, because oftentimes I think newcomers would just freeze because they just they feel like they don't know enough, and and they don't know what to do. So drawing really helps them to get their ideas onto paper. And of course, the teacher should model how poorly they do stick figures and all of that too, as I did. I'm a terrible artist, and that's fine, no big deal. But then they should label the pictures. So now you've got words coming out, just words, because this represents the word level, which is where beginners are. And of course, the silent period, to a certain extent, is also taken into account here. But it also avoids the writing block when you do drawing, because now you've generated some ideas and you can go on from those, and then you can write from self-generated or found images. So some students didn't want to draw. They felt self-conscious about it, particularly some of the older students. So my graduate students did a couple of things. Some of them would put like a manila folder in front of that so nobody else could see the students drawing. And she said, only you and I will see the drawing. So that was one way of doing it. Or some of the teachers just said, okay, go ahead, start writing. And that was fine. Another teacher had some magazines, and she said you could find a picture in the magazine that would represent, what you're thinking. That takes a little bit longer. So you really do have to sort of limit that kind of time. And you have to limit the drawing too. Some students could just draw all day long. So we had to put a timer on for that. But that really helps the students to generate their ideas and get them on paper, so that they can go to the next stage, which is actually writing the sentences, the way they're supposed to on a graphic organizer, and develop a paragraph. One thing that we did in the Institute was even, kindergartners, they were able to do one sentence, at least three words in one sentence. That was our goal for them. But first through high school, we wanted them to write at least a 3-sentence paragraph. And and they did it. So many of them did it. It's just amazing. I know people were like, oh, they're too young or whatever. Oh no, they were rocking it. Those little first graders were writing about community helpers and why they wanted to be a community helper. And it was just adorable. I mean, they needed a little more support than, maybe some of the older students, but they still, they did it, and they were able to express themselves as best they could. A lot of them were also still in that sort of early script writing, so they didn't form the letters properly, so there was a little bit of a guesswork sometimes for the teacher as to what they were saying, but the children would tell you what they wanted to say as best they could. So it was really cute to watch that, definitely. But then in this writing time, we also want them to use the word line tool. So this is a placeholder. And again, you model that with your final product in the pre-writing, but it helps them to not to stop. I don't know if you ever had students, Tom, that just stopped and said, "Sir, what is this word?" Or I don't know, blah blah blah, and it stops their fluency and their thought. So what we do is we teach them to use the line, and we'll go back and we'll fill that in later. And what we found was the students were doing that. They were just, they were looking for a second. And sometimes they would ask for help, but if they didn't get the help, they would just put a line and keep going. And, so it ended up being a pretty powerful tool to use. So I did a little research into placeholders, and I learned that famous authors and screenwriters, for example, I learned that in the Star Trek team, they would use a placeholder. It wasn't a line; it was actually a word in their script until they could figure out what Captain Kirk said to, Dr. Spock or something. It's pretty cool. So I thought, placeholders are important. So that's the writing stage. And, that could take some time. You may have to limit that in your writing workshop, but for the most part, those are the techniques we use with the newcomers. And certainly all the students in your class could use that. So when I did my dissertation, I did drawings in boxes and organized it. So yeah, it's something we all can use. So
You use your own method for your dissertation because it can work for newcomers and people who are getting their
exactly.
doctorates.
Exactly, absolutely. So then in the end, you get this sort of unfiltered writing sample that the teacher will now use for the instruction, and the sort of structured literacy instruction that you will do in the editing and revising stage.
Perfect. Let's talk about that.
Okay.
Let's now talk about the next phase, which is now editing and writing and editing, revising. And what does that look like within the cultural celebrations or sports context?
Absolutely. So the students, for example, have written their narrative or they have written their informative piece. And again, it's maybe 3 sentences, 4 or 5 sentences, with as many words as they can produce in English. And then the teacher does a one-on-one with the student. And this was something that I really had to get the graduate students to kind of relinquish their power, if you will, because they would start reading to the student. And I said, no, they are the author. So they need to read to you what they have written. And so for the teacher underwriting, that's sort of the first review, if you will, of what the student has written. And the student is to read that back to you. Now, some of the students were hesitant to do that. Some of them were, unable to for whatever, they figured out how to write it or they asked their friends or what have you. So if they are hesitant and don't want to read it back to you, you can offer choral reading. So let's read it together. And then usually the students would, allow that. And then, the teacher could go along. But you really want to hear what the student is thinking. And the teacher should then be underwriting at that point after they have gone through the whole piece. So don't do anything, don't touch anything until you've finished the whole writing piece that the student has done. And then you can go back in and correct some omissions. Oftentimes, newcomers will drop certain words, prepositions, or the verb to be, that doesn't exist in a lot of languages. So, that's when you can correct some of the syntax. It's also the time to go back in and so the teacher's underwriting those words in there, but now you want them to also identify or underline, maybe not even underline, but just identify 3, maybe 5 with a high school. You can have 5 misspelled words. So if there are words that are misspelled there, and with newcomers, there can be a lot of misspelled words. But I find that, actually, I made this mistake, to be honest. As a new teacher, I used to think that if a student wrote something incorrectly and I didn't show them the correction, it was going to fossilize and they were going to learn it incorrectly because they think it's right. And it was to the point where, especially with my newcomers, I almost bloody read their pages. It was awful. And plus I used red, which was stupid. But, and I learned later why that was not a good thing. But, you could barely see their original writing for all my corrections. And I once had a student, she was Danish. I remember so vividly. And she looked at the paper I handed back to her, and it was all these corrections. And she threw it back at me and she said, "I'm stupid." And it was like, no, and then I realized that, that was my aha moment. I thought, oh my gosh, I crushed her confidence. And, so I had to really think about it and sit down and say to myself, okay, now what do I do? And then I thought, the power of three. So for me, the power of three is really, really great that, the brain can only take in so much. And so three errors would be as much as I could probably take. And I kind of remember, when I was corrected in Turkish, after a while, it was just all white noise, because there were so many corrections. So I thought, I'm not going to do that anymore. So what I suggest to the teachers is choose at least three words and go through the phonics flexing, which we're going to do in a minute. And then you can either underline the other words and say, we'll do those later, we'll look at those later if that is comfortable to them, or just let that go, because truly the newcomer is not going to be able to take in all this error correction, So, so this is the time to do that sort of personalized error instruction or error correction. And then the next step very quickly into that is the phonics flexing. So when you have identified those words, for example, in the context of the sports, you've corrected the syntax of the sentence or the paragraph, and now you're keying in on three words. Let's say you choose three words that were misspelled, that were essential to the communication. Not just the first three words that were misspelled, but the ones that were important to the context. Or it may be a certain error that you're seeing repeatedly with a student. Like, for example, some students write a T instead of ED as the past tense for whatever reason. So if you see that a few times, maybe that's the thing you have to work on. So it's a judgment call for the teacher, really. But, keep it to three, maybe five, again, if you have the time, because this is one-on-one. What are the other students doing around you? So, you have to be kind of careful about that. But then you go into phonics flexing. So this is something I designed very specifically for the newcomers as personalized instruction, because literacy instruction, because the curricula no longer, gives them the phonics and, those foundational literacy skills once you hit, fourth grade on up. Yet RLs need that because, the English learners are coming with a completely different system in their head, and they need to understand our letter sound correspondence. So what you do is you look at a word. Let's say I had a student who was writing a book. I had my students write animal books as an informative writing piece. And I had them do table of contents and index and the whole bit. So this one student wrote for the word table and table of contents, TAPL. So, I said, okay. And I tapped the T. I said, you heard T. And so I wrote it beneath the word, the T. Again, that was the teacher underwriting part. But I tapped that T to positively reinforce that student, wrote the right letter for the sound. And then I flexed through the whole word, table. And then the next phoneme was the A, and and they wrote the A. So I tapped the A, and I said, you heard the A, table. And then the P, I didn't touch it. I didn't reinforce it. I just put the next letter as I was teacher underwriting, and then table. And then I tapped the L because they heard the L, and then I put the L in my underwriting, and then I added the E, and I said, we'll talk about the silent E, a little bit later. But then I said table again. So each phoneme of that word was highlighted, and the brain had the attention to it and the relationship of the letter sound in English. But we don't speak in phonemes. So I flex through the whole word. And so that's what phonics flexing is all about.
So you're saying you're using the particular word that students have written and using that as a context to teach them phonics. What a thoughtful
Correct.
idea, right? Really.
Perfect. Yeah.
So let's talk about, you've mentioned the term teacher underwriting. Can you talk more about that? Like, what is that? Define that for us.
Yeah. So the teacher is going to, when the child is finished reading or their choral reading is finished, the teacher is going to write the corrections underneath what the child has written. So that's why it's underwriting. So it's underneath what the original writing is. And then the students will be asked to rewrite with the corrections for publication, which is a technique
Got
we'll get
it.
to in a moment. Yeah, yeah.
Which
So
is perfect. Let's talk about that. The last phase is publishing. What do we do there?
great. So in publishing, two things are sort of coming from that editing and revising phase. One is that the teacher should be recording somehow, either in their head or afterwards, jot down some of the errors that they saw the students were producing, and create mini lessons. And I mean mini lessons, like 5-minute mini lessons, to deliver either as a small group instruction. If they see it common amongst the whole class, certainly they could do very quick, I call them write to spell mini lessons, but they're generally pulled from the errors that the students are making. It's not sort of a proactive approach to teaching structured literacy. This is a reactive or responsive approach. And so that the teachers will prepare a very quick, and I have sort of a formula: introduce the rule, or whatever they are seeing. It could be the ed. Some students have trouble putting n's and d's together in the word, like second or friend. So there's some unusual errors that teachers are seeing, but for the most part, you'll see common ones: dropping the verb to be, contractions that aren't formed correctly, things like that. And then you will put those together. And if you have a group of students who are all making that same error, then you could deliver this lesson in a small group scenario, or you can do it one-on-one if need be. So that's one technique that you want to think about. And then the next is the rewrite for repetition, preparing for the publishing. And for native speakers, I think that the rewriting isn't necessarily, it could be a bit redundant. You certainly can have them do that, but they can continue to draw maybe, or something else. But for English learners, particularly newcomers, they need to learn that system of English and the patterns of English. So having them rewrite with the corrected underwriting is going to help them to learn the patterns of English. And I did a lot of rewriting in Turkish to kind of get it right. And so I see the value in that. And I saw it for myself, actually. And so I think it's really important for the students to do that to the best of their ability. Are they rewriting some of the errors that weren't corrected? Yes. But again, they can't take them all in at one time. So, eventually you'll continue to do this, and think about that over a whole school year. They're going to learn so much, and they're going to learn it incrementally. Once they've gotten one thing down, now they move to the next thing. Kind of like I said, when I'm learning Excel spreadsheets, I mastered one thing. Now I'm going to move on to the next, pivot tables or whatever. So it's sort of the same concept there. So that's the publishing stage. And you can certainly share the writing with the whole class. You can have author's chair, you can put them out in the hallway, whatever the teachers want to do. But I told my graduate students, and I thought this was important too, to take their rewrite and just tape it over their original writing, because oftentimes there's a picture above and some of the paper that they use. And so you can just literally cut out their new polished edition and put that over, and they can, see that. So, so they get a sense of pride, I think, when they see something, hey, they wrote in a foreign language. That's pretty awesome, so, and they can do it. Yeah. So, it makes me so excited to see and watch the students just grow in such a kind of a short amount of time, as I mentioned. So
Would you share with us a story of one of the students who you've worked with, like one of the students that the graduate students worked with, and like how did they engage through this process?
yeah, so let me try to think about. There was a student in a fifth grade class that they were doing, well, they were doing the sports theme because that was decided by the migrant ed program, which themes were being used. We decided which writing activity they would do. And this one little boy, he was Kinnawandan speaker, very shy, didn't kind of kept to himself a little bit, but he was pretty good at drawing. And so when he did the drawing and then he started writing and asking some of his friends and so forth. And then he um, did his rewrite and it was pasted over, taped over. The teachers asked if does anybody want to come up and present? And here's this rather shy young man standing up there and showing everyone his picture. And I just thought to myself, wow, the confidence that he gained. But he went from, not really communicating at all week one to week 4 when they were doing this informative piece, to be able to stand up in front of a group of peers basically, and showing his writing and showing his picture and speaking. He didn't speak as much as he wrote, but he was speaking in this foreign language, and we just saw him blossom. So I thought that was pretty powerful, and I think that was through the writing because he was writing things before he was speaking them. And that's the key, which I did the same thing. I would write something and then I would write, kind of like my notes that I have, I'm writing things down before I'm speaking. And it kind of is my thought process and the way I do things as well. So, I saw this young man doing something similar. So I thought it was pretty great. Yeah.
How does starting with writing, help their speaking and reading and listening?
Well, because they know what they want to say, and then they find the word. If you're just trying to speak without ever seeing the word or knowing, what the word is in English, it's not coming out. It's just not going to be available to you for any kind of recall. But if you see it written or you write it down yourself, I mean, even seeing it written, in a dictionary or what have you, and you can try to pronounce it. But then the power of you writing it is getting all of those neurological systems going to be able to pull that from, working memory, short-term memory, working memory into long-term memory, particularly if you do it with repetition. So I don't know if you've ever read the book by David Salsa. I'm not sure how to say his name, How the L Brain Learns. And it's an excellent book. And he talks about how we take in through senses, of course, and that's in short-term memory. So you're hearing something, maybe you're reading something, but it won't go anywhere. It'll slip off the sort of clipboard or whatever. He has a demonstration of that. If you don't have need, if you don't have emotion tied to it, or you don't have repetition. And if you have those 3 things, it moves into one of those 3 things. It can move to working memory, and now you're using it, and that's why practice and using it in those mini lessons, for example, the right to spell mini lessons, you want to introduce the sort of linguistic point, give a example or 2, and then give them a practice, 3 or 4 practices, very quick, less than 5 minutes, but it's powerful because it's going to move it from the short-term memory attention to the working memory, and then later to the long-term memory.
Right.
So it's an important thing for the recall as well. So now they can, sort of in their mind's eye, see the word that they want to say. And that's how writing can influence the speaking.
Right. And that's very much why your title is called, has the word integrated.
Correct. Yes. And it's also because it's integrated into the writing process. I had some teachers who would say to me, I have to plan for the elves. It's like, they're on another planet. And I'm like, oh, what? I would literally, someone said that to me and I said, no, I said, you just need to tweak a few, strategies or, think about planning a little bit, so, I wanted to make sure that this was integrated in that, because I wrote this book for content teachers, to be honest. ELA, ESL teachers will certainly be able to use this, and hopefully they'll have a system of techniques that they can use along the way. In fact, I just presented the book and the L writing process at the New York State TESOL conference about a week ago, and several people came up to me and said, "Oh, finally, I have something that is systematic and I know what to do with my newcomers." So I thought that was, helpful. And they were ESL teachers, or ENL teachers, as they call them in New York. Because truly, I understood that. I didn't know how to teach writing. I'm a fellow of the National Writing Project. I don't know if you're familiar with that here in the States. And my particular course that I took, they teach you how to walk the walk and talk the talk as teachers of writing. And my mind was geared towards L's. So I realized how little I knew about teaching writing when I went through that course, so it's been sort of upmost in my mind. And then also when I trained as an Orton Gillingham, the approach trainer, I learned about how to teach systematically, teach the reading, the foundational skills of reading with a system. And I started using it with my English learners, not only with my dyslexic son to help him to learn, but also, with my L's. And it worked. It was great. Really unlocked, it broke the code for them. So, so I was looking for a way of sort of doing the same for writing. So that's why I wrote the book. And I wrote it in two parts. So if your listeners are teaching English as a foreign language or an additional language, just jump to part 2 if you're reading it, because you don't need the basics of what's language acquisition and all of that. So you probably know that already. But I put that in there, part 1, for content teachers, so they understand the process. So yeah.
You're contextualizing it for teachers. Like if you're a content teacher, read part 1 and then read part 2. If you're an ESL teacher or a teacher of if you're an ELD teacher, move to then part 2.
Correct. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right.
I even have a needs assessment survey that the reader will read ahead of time to know where they should start, whether they should start in part 1 or part 2.
I have one final question about the
Mm-hmm.
writing step part where it says draw to draft. When they, after they finish drawing their ideas about, like, let's say celebrations where they are drawing a feast,
Mm-hmm.
or an activity during a celebration, how do they move from the drawing to the writing phase if
Sure.
they're newcomers?
Right. So, in the pre-writing stage, the teacher has shown the process, of what they're doing to get the idea across to the newcomers, what they're writing, whether they're writing a narrative or writing 3 reasons why they like a certain season, or what have you, or 3 reasons for the Civil War, American Civil War, and they're presented information and so forth. So from there, the students have labeled their pictures. That was another instructional point. And then some of the teachers gave them a second graphic organizer to help them with topic sentence, 3 details, and conclusion, for example, or beginning, middle, and end. So they showed them how to take the words from the pictures and now put them into a sentence. And those sentences were modeled in the final product model, or the teachers may do another quick example of sentences. But that's how they move into that exactly. And then they can either usually what they did was hand that in. So it was their sentence writing was on a graphic organizer already. Or some teachers would give them the paper that they had drawn maybe some pictures on, and then they gave them another piece of paper to begin writing. So you could go either way, and you could sort of have to know how your students are able to move on and give them that time. But generally the students were ready after they drew and then they labeled, and they were able to start writing their sentences, complete sentences. Yeah.
It seems like the picture word induction model where students are labeling different verbs and different nouns really, and then
Mhm.
adjectives, but they're also adding like verbs, like what this person in the drawing is doing. And
Mhm.
then that becomes a visual word bank for them. But then it goes into the structured writing. So which is super helpful.
Yeah, good. Yeah, it's very personalized, and their word wall, so to speak, that they're creating. Absolutely. And if the teacher has enough time, they could do those expanders. They say, okay, look at your drawing and your labels. Now put that adjective in there, or let's talk about the adverbs. So the teacher doesn't have to have them jump right into the writing. Maybe they need to fluff up, if you will, a little bit or expand the labels that they have, and then be able to move them into the writing, sentence level writing. Yeah. And the paragraph writing, um, you know, you could give them the paragraph frame, similar to something you recently posted, a few of those, uh, paragraph frames. Yeah. So teachers can use those as well. Absolutely. Yeah. I've
Oh,
seen
wow,
that
you looked
on
at English.
high school. High school level often does that. Mm-hmm.
Well, I always end with the podcast with asking teachers, the guests to share a green light. Like, what is a green light which means like, let's start with a single step. What can they do to get started with your process?
So the green light would be, I think, to look at your pre-writing. What is it? They can't do an output without an input. So really look at the input and how you are able to get through to the newcomers. Simplify those graphic organizers as best you can. And I have some examples in the book. And then there's also free resources, as I think I may have mentioned, on the Rutledge.com website. So the web page where my book is, there are supplemental materials, and you'll see some of these simplified graphic organizers. So I think that's a great place to start, and make sure you have a model of your final product, because that's the expectation you want the students to have. I've coached a lot of teachers now, and several of them have said, as soon as I did that, boom, I could see where the students started writing more. So they knew what was expected of them, because I think the newcomers were unsure about their own writing. And so by going through um, the steps in the draw to draft is another one that definitely teachers could start employing more often. It's not new. It's not something, wow. But I just found so many teachers don't think to use it. They don't facilitate that, and that's what I'm trying to encourage teachers to do, for sure.
Well,
So.
you started off talking about your experience learning Turkish, and you said writing was the doorway to the language. And so, with your
Mhm.
book, I wanted to say thank you for opening a doorway for our colleagues
Mhm.
out there to start writing with their newcomers. So, imagine saying the words newcomers, the sentence newcomers, and writing in the same sentence, and like you've made it possible for them. So, Dr. Krimmel, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and to your listeners, and thank you for, again, all that you do for our profession. So it's been an honor to be here. Thank you so much.